On a freezing December night in 1776, a ragged army, barefoot, starving, and nearly defeated, stood at the edge of a dark, ice-choked river. History had almost written them off, but what happened over the next 24 hours would not only shock the world, it would change the fate of a nation forever. The wind cut like a blade across the Delaware River, carrying with it the whispers of failure. General George Washington stood silently, his cloak snapping behind him like a flag in a storm. Before him stretched a desperate gamble, one that would either resurrect a dying revolution or bury it forever. His army was in ruins. Only months earlier, hope had burned bright. The colonies had declared independence, defying the most powerful empire on earth. But reality had come crashing down with brutal force. British troops had driven Washington's army out of New York, chased them across New Jersey, and left them broken, exhausted, and demoralized. Men deserted daily, supplies were nearly gone, morale was shattered, and worst of all, time was running out. Most enlistments were set to expire at the end of the year. If Washington didn't act, and act boldly, there would be no army left to fight for independence. The revolution was on the brink of collapse. Yet in that darkness, Washington saw something others did not, an opportunity hidden inside desperation. Across the river, in the small town of Trenton, Hessian mercenaries, German soldiers hired by the British, were encamped. Confident and relaxed after weeks of victory, they believed the rebellion was all but finished. Christmas celebrations had dulled their vigilance. They never expected an attack, especially not in the dead of winter, especially not from a beaten army, especially not at night. Washington made his decision. They would cross the river. The plan was audacious, bordering on madness. The Delaware River was choked with ice, its current swift and unforgiving. Crossing it with thousands of men, horses, and artillery under the cover of darkness was nearly impossible. Storm clouds gathered overhead, threatening snow and sleet. But Washington had no choice. Failure meant the end. Success might just reignite the revolution. As night fell on December 25, 1776, the operation began. Boats creaked under the weight of soldiers. Ice slammed against wooden hulls. Men struggled to keep their footing on frozen decks. Some slipped into the freezing water and never resurfaced. The storm intensified. Snow mixed with rain, turning the night into chaos. Visibility dropped. Orders were lost in the howling wind. Even Washington's closest officers began to doubt. But Washington did not waver. He stood tall in the boat, guiding the crossing, his presence alone holding the fragile operation together. The image of him, resolute, unshaken, would later become one of the most iconic symbols of American history. Hours passed. What should have taken a short time stretched into an agonizing ordeal. By the time the last troops reached the New Jersey side, it was already late, far behind schedule. Some commanders urged retreat. It was too risky now. Dawn was approaching. The element of surprise would be lost. But Washington pressed on. There was no turning back. The march to Trenton was brutal. Soldiers trudged through snow and ice, many without proper shoes. Blood stained the frozen ground where bare feet split open from the cold. Guns had to be kept dry at all costs, forcing men to carry them high despite exhaustion. Yet something strange began to happen. As the army moved forward, a quiet determination spread among the ranks. These men knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. They had already lost so much. Now they had nothing left to lose. At dawn on December 26, 1776, Washington's army reached Trenton. The Hessians were completely unprepared. Still recovering from the previous night's celebrations, they were caught off guard by the sudden roar of cannon fire and the sight of American troops pouring into the town.
Chaos erupted. Hessian soldiers scrambled to organize a defense, but confusion spread faster than orders could be given. Streets filled with smoke, gunfire echoed off buildings, and panic took hold. Washington's forces moved with precision. They cut off escape routes. They pressed the attack relentlessly. Within less than an hour, it was over. The Hessians surrendered. Nearly 1,000 enemy troops were captured. American casualties? Minimal. It was a stunning, unbelievable victory. The impact was immediate. News of the victory spread like wildfire. What had seemed like a dying rebellion suddenly looked alive again. Morale surged. Enlistments increased. Confidence returned. Washington had done the impossible. He had taken a broken army and turned it into a symbol of hope. But the story doesn't end there, because Washington knew something critical. One victory wasn't enough. He needed to build momentum, and fast. Within days, he launched another bold move, this time at Princeton, again against overwhelming odds, again in the dead of winter, again with everything on the line. And once more, he won. These victories didn't just change the course of the war, they changed how the world saw the American Revolution. Foreign powers, especially France, began to take notice. If this struggling group of colonies could defeat British forces, even in small battles, perhaps they were worth supporting, and that support would prove decisive. Looking back, historians often point to the crossing of the Delaware as a turning point, not because it was the largest battle, or the bloodiest, or the most strategically complex, but because it was the moment of hope returned. It was the moment when a nearly defeated army chose courage over surrender. It was the moment when one leader's belief refused to break, even when everything else did. But what makes this story truly astonishing isn't just the victory, it's how close it came to never happening. If Washington had listened to doubt, if the storm had been worse, if the river had claimed more lives, if the Hessians had been more alert, history might look completely different today. There might not be United States as we know it. Instead, against all odds, a freezing river became the birthplace of resilience. A desperate gamble became a legendary triumph, and a nearly forgotten army became the foundation of a nation. Even today, the story resonates because it's not just about war, it's about perseverance, about leadership under pressure, about taking risks when failure seems certain, about believing in something greater even when the world says it's impossible. And perhaps that's why, centuries later, the image still stands. A determined leader, standing tall in a fragile boat, surrounded by chaos, moving forward into the unknown. Not because success was guaranteed, but because giving up was never an option.